Welcome, dearly beloved anointed ones. The most dangerous thing you can be in a crooked world is clean. And if you don't believe it, ask anyone who's ever dared to keep their hands, their conscience and their spirit spotless while surrounded by people knee-deep in deception. Most people aren't interested in understanding a pure heart. They're obsessed with finding a flaw to feel better about their own, because goodness, when it's real, exposes everything counterfeit around it. Fun fact: psychology proves that people naturally distrust what feels too good to be true, not because it is, but because it threatens the lies they've made peace with. And when you walked into their world, carrying nothing but your truth, your quiet resilience, and a clean soul, you disrupted the ecosystem of fakeness they spent years perfecting. For 1,825 days, you lived under their microscope. Not out of curiosity, but out of desperate hope that they'd find something wrong with you, a flaw, a contradiction, a scandal, anything to prove you weren't what you appeared to be. Because if you really were that solid, that would mean they had no excuse for being the way they are. And after all that time, after all the watching, the plotting, the hoping, they found nothing. Not even a shady group chat. Not even a dusty skeleton in the back of the closet. You were exactly who you claimed to be. And nothing makes people angrier than a person they can't expose. This is what happens when a clean soul survives in a dirty world. And today, we're going to talk about it. Number one, they studied you, hoping to find a stain that justified their own filth. They weren't watching you because they cared. They weren't studying you because they admired you. The truth is, they were hoping to find something, anything, that would justify the filth they'd grown comfortable living in. People like that don't hate you for what you've done. They hate you for what they can't prove you did. They needed to find a stain on you because if you were really as clean as you appeared, it meant they had no excuse for their own dirt. And for 5 long years, they waited for you to trip, to lie, to snap, to expose some hidden flaw they could run and tell the world about. It's not that they thought you were perfect, it's that they needed you not to be. Every time you stayed silent when they tried to provoke you, every time you walked away when you could have lashed out, every time you held your head up while they whispered behind your back, it drove them a little closer to madness. Because if you weren't secretly a snake like them, if you weren't hiding the same darkness they were choking on, then it meant they'd willingly become what you refused to. And people would rather destroy the truth than face it. They convinced themselves you had to be faking it. Nobody could be that unbothered, that solid, that unshaken. They called you fake, too good to be true, a pretender, not because of anything you did, but because your very existence forced them to confront parts of themselves they didn't want to acknowledge. The longer you walked upright in the mess they wallowed in, the more desperate they became to find something ugly in you. It wasn't curiosity, it was survival. They needed to prove to themselves that goodness was a myth, because if you were real, then their excuses, their betrayals, their cowardice would have no defense. And when they found nothing, it wasn't relief they felt, it was rage. Number two, your purity highlighted the rot in their spirit. Your presence wasn't just something they noticed. It unsettled them in ways they couldn't explain. You didn't have to say a word, and yet you somehow managed to make people uncomfortable just by existing in the same space. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't attitude, and it definitely wasn't because you were doing anything wrong. It was because your clean spirit exposed everything they tried to keep hidden. The lies they told, the fake friendships they maintained, the sneaky things they did behind closed doors. All of it felt a little too obvious when you were around. People love to surround themselves with others who are just as flawed, just as messy, just as broken in the same places. It makes their guilt easier to swallow. But when someone steps into the room who carries themselves differently, who doesn't need to step on others to feel tall, who doesn't laugh at cruel jokes just to fit in, it shifts the atmosphere. You didn't even realize it, but your energy acted like a mirror. And whether they wanted to or not, they caught glimpses of the parts of themselves they tried to bury. That's why they kept watching you, not because they cared what you were doing, but because you made them feel things they weren't ready to deal with. They would catch themselves comparing their behavior to yours. Every small act of kindness, every time you kept your word, every moment you handled situations with grace instead of petty revenge, it was a reminder that they could have made different choices too. And nothing stings more than realizing you had the same options as someone else but chose the lower road. You didn't mean to make them feel like that. It wasn't your mission to expose anyone, but light doesn't have to announce itself. It just shines, and darkness will always feel uneasy in its presence. Number 3, they didn't want to understand you. They wanted to unmask you. They weren't looking to understand you. They were looking for a reason to discredit you. They needed to find something, anything, that would let them off the hook for their own shortcomings. If they could catch you doing something wrong, if they could expose a flaw, it would make them feel less guilty about their own mistakes. But that's not how it works, is it? They weren't interested in your story. They weren't trying to know you as a person. They just wanted to find an opening, a crack in your armor where they could plant their doubt and say, "See, I knew they weren't perfect." They thought they could break you down into something they could control, something that was just as messy as they felt inside. But that's the thing about a clean soul. It doesn't need to be defended. It doesn't need to prove anything. You weren't hiding behind walls of pride or secrets. You didn't need to justify your worth with excuses or deflections. You stood tall in your truth, and that's what made them so uncomfortable. They didn't know how to deal with someone who wasn't scrambling for approval or constantly trying to hide their flaws. They weren't used to someone who didn't have skeletons in the closet or stories to cover up. You weren't perfect, but you didn't need to be. You had nothing to hide, and that was the real issue. Their obsession wasn't with you. It was with the idea that maybe, just maybe, you were living proof that it's possible to walk through life without betraying yourself, that you didn't need to lie, cheat, or manipulate to survive. You exposed a painful truth to them. They had settled for less than what they could have been, and they didn't know how to live with that realization. So they looked for dirt, they looked for cracks, hoping they could catch you slipping. But every time they searched, all they found was a reflection of everything they refused to be. And that's what made them furious. Number 4, you became their silent confessor. They thought they were studying you, analyzing your every move, trying to find any inconsistency that would allow them to label you as just like them. What they failed to see was that in their relentless attempts to dissect your life, they were actually revealing more about themselves than they ever intended to. Every accusation they threw at you wasn't about your actions or character. It was a direct reflection of the guilt and shame they were trying to hide within themselves. They saw things in you that triggered their own insecurities, their own hidden darkness, and they couldn't bear to confront it. So they projected it onto you. Every false narrative they created, every assumption they made about you was just their own subconscious confessing to the things they were too afraid to admit to themselves. They saw your integrity and confused it for weakness because deep down they couldn't understand how someone could stay true in a world that rewards deceit. So they had to spin a story that made them feel less threatened. But that story wasn't about you. It was a confession of their own failings. They couldn't handle the purity you embodied because it made them face the parts of themselves they'd spent years burying. And instead of owning it, they projected it onto you. In truth, you became their silent confessor. They didn't want your forgiveness. They just wanted to feel like they could somehow absolve themselves by accusing you. The more they searched for dirt on you, the more they revealed their own inner chaos. The more they scrutinized your every move, the more they exposed their inability to accept the truth about who they had become. And while they were digging through your past, trying to find a way to discredit you, they were really just digging their own grave. They were confessing, not to you, but to the parts of themselves that had long been buried in denial. Number 5, the test wasn't yours. It was theirs. For 1,825 days, they watched you under a magnifying glass, convinced that you were the one being tested. They thought you were the one on trial, that your every action, every word was being scrutinized for signs of imperfection, for any excuse to strip away the image they had created of you. But what they didn't realize was that it wasn't you who was being tested, it was them. The universe wasn't watching you to see if you would crack under pressure. It was watching them to see how they would respond to something they couldn't manipulate, control, or even understand. Your integrity. How would they treat someone who wasn't playing the same dirty game? How would they handle the presence of someone whose heart wasn't filled with deceit or selfish ambition? How would they react to someone who didn't just talk about values but actually lived them, even when the world encouraged compromise, and time again they failed? Not because you were flawless, but because they mistook your decency for weakness. They couldn't fathom that someone could remain steadfast and kind without needing to control or take advantage of others. To them, your resilience felt like an attack. It threatened the way they had chosen to live, the lies they told themselves to justify their own failures. Instead of seeing your strength in staying true to yourself, they saw it as a reminder of their own inability to do the same. They believed character was something to be used when it was convenient, a tool to manipulate situations, not a foundation to stand on when everything around you is crumbling. But you were different. You didn't bend to circumstances. You didn't fold when it was easier to follow the crowd. And while they waited for you to fail, they were the ones who lost. Lost in bitterness, lost in jealousy, and ultimately lost in their failure to pass the test that had been placed before them. The test wasn't yours. It was theirs. And they flunked. Number 6. Your clean soul was a threat to the social contracts of hypocrisy. In a world where everyone seems to settle for the comfort of pretending, your clean soul was like a wrecking ball to the very foundation of their existence. People have built entire social structures around the idea of pretending. Pretending to care when they don't, pretending to be loyal while secretly scheming behind closed doors, pretending to be righteous while their actions tell a different story. These unspoken contracts, these fragile agreements to live in mediocrity, are what keep most people comfortable. They give themselves permission to keep doing the bare minimum, to coast through life, and still get the validation they crave. But then you came along. You didn't just pretend. You lived by the standards they only spoke about, and that was a threat. By actually embodying decency, you shattered the delicate balance they'd created between their inner contradictions and the mask they wore for the world. Your commitment to truth, integrity, and honesty wasn't just admirable to some. It was uncomfortable to them, because it exposed the lies they had come to believe were necessary to survive. You weren't just showing up to play the game. You weren't pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. You didn't choose the easy route of moral laziness or convenience. And in doing so, you destabilized everything they thought they knew about how the world worked. Every time you didn't gossip, every time you stayed quiet when they expected you to join in their judgment, every time you refused to compromise your values, you were chipping away at the foundation of their social contracts. It was like holding up a mirror to their own hypocrisy. And no one likes what they see when they stare into that kind of reflection. Your clean soul didn't just challenge their actions, it challenged their very way of living. It made them realize that they were living in a world of pretense, and maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to. But rather than change, they'd rather accuse you of being too good because it's easier than confronting their own lack of integrity. Number 7. They were secretly envious of the weight you could carry without breaking. They saw how much you carried, how heavy the weight on your shoulders was, and they couldn't understand why it didn't break you. They watched as you absorbed betrayal after betrayal, endured isolation that would have crushed most, and carried invisible burdens that no one could see. Yet you didn't falter, you didn't cave, you didn't scream for help or crumble under the pressure, and that terrified them. It wasn't your perfection that disturbed them. It was your unexplainable resilience, that part of you that refused to fold, refused to break, no matter how much life threw at you. It was that strength, that silent endurance that made them feel small, even though you never said a word. In a world full of people who collapse the moment things get hard, who would sell their integrity for a little peace or relief, you stood firm. When others would have turned to shortcuts, manipulation, or simply given up, you didn't. You kept going. And that wasn't something they could comprehend. They couldn't understand how someone could withstand so much without giving in, without losing themselves. They would have folded under half the pressure you faced, would have bent the rules, would have compromised their values for a second of relief. But you didn't. It wasn't just that you endured, it was that you did it with grace. You didn't wear your struggles like a badge of honor. You didn't boast about how tough you were or play the victim. You just kept moving forward, carrying your burdens quietly because you knew who you were and what you stood for, and that made them envious. Not because you were perfect, but because they couldn't figure out how you could carry so much and still stand tall. You had something they could never understand. A strength of character so solid, so unshakable that nothing could break you, and that in their eyes made you untouchable. Number 8, you became the unwritten chapter in their story of regret. In the stories they'll tell about their lives, your name will be the one that's quietly skipped over, hidden in the footnotes of their regrets. They won't mention you in the future because acknowledging you would mean facing everything they failed to do, everything they chose not to be. You were the road they saw but didn't have the courage to walk. You were the integrity they could have embraced but turned away from. And deep down they knew you were everything they pretended to be, everything they claimed they valued but never had the strength to embody. As they look back on their lives, your chapter will be the one that doesn't fit into their narrative of excuses, self-justifications, and convenient compromises. You were the standard they couldn't meet, not because they didn't have the potential, but because they were too afraid to hold themselves to it. You forced them to confront the version of themselves they could have been if only they'd chosen honesty over convenience, courage over fear, and integrity over the temptations of a shortcut. And it ate at them every day. Your life, your choices, your unshakable commitment to being the person you claimed to be, it was a mirror they could never quite face. In their moments of quiet reflection, they will think of you and feel the sting of their own abandonment of what they knew was right. They won't admit it, not even to themselves, but somewhere deep inside, they'll know that in you, they saw the potential they let slip through their fingers. You became the unwritten chapter, not because you didn't matter, but because your existence exposed their deepest regrets. And when the story of their life is told, your absence will speak louder than any word they could say. Number 9, you were the example that exposed their excuses. Every time they muttered the phrase, "That's just how the world works," your very existence was a challenge to that narrative. You didn't just accept the world as it was, you refused to be shaped by its harshness, and in doing so, you exposed the lie they told themselves to justify their failures. You didn't bend when things got tough. You didn't bow down when life demanded you compromise your values. You stood tall, even when the fire burned hot. And with every single step you took, you made it impossible for them to keep using their excuses. For years, they leaned on the belief that the world was cold, that people were selfish, that dishonesty was just a survival mechanism. They told themselves that betrayal was normal, that the morally lazy were just playing the game smarter, that it was okay to take shortcuts because everyone else does it. But then you came along and you lived as living proof that there was another way. You didn't need to manipulate, lie, or betray others to succeed. You didn't need to sacrifice your integrity to survive in a world that's often unforgiving. You stood firm in your convictions, even when it would have been easier to cave. You didn't bend to the toxic beliefs that everyone else accepted as truth. And every time they saw you walk through the storm without losing yourself, it gnawed at them. They could no longer hide behind their excuses. If you could endure, if you could thrive without surrendering your soul, then their decision to crawl was just that, a choice. It wasn't the result of some external force. It was their own failure to step up. They couldn't ignore that anymore. And that truth, the one they were desperately trying to avoid, became too painful to face. Because you exposed the fact that their choices weren't born out of necessity, but out of fear and unwillingness to evolve. Number 10. They weaponized proximity, hoping to contaminate you. Make no mistake. Many who came close didn't have good intentions. They didn't come to learn from you, to be inspired by your strength, or to grow in your presence. No, they came with a different motive altogether. They sought proximity, not to elevate themselves, but to leech off your light. They thought that if they stayed close enough, they could absorb some of your energy, some of your purity, and use it to feed their own agenda. They believed that being near you would grant them the power to manipulate, reshape, or corrupt your essence into something more palatable for their own comfort. They weren't drawn to your authenticity. They were drawn to the fact that your soul was clean and untainted by the filth they were swimming in. They saw your strength, your clarity, and they thought that by being close they could find a way to contaminate you, to convince you that their way of thinking, their lack of integrity, was the right way. They didn't understand that they were powerless in the face of your unshakable core. They underestimated how unbothered you were by their attempts to bend you to their will. They tried to manipulate situations, plant seeds of doubt, or nudge you toward their level of mediocrity, but you remained untouched. Your light wasn't something they could dim. Your peace wasn't something they could disturb. No matter how close they got, they couldn't break you. They wanted you to compromise, to make concessions for their comfort, but you stayed true to yourself. You didn't need to fight back because you knew the truth. Their darkness could never touch your light. You were untamed, unbreakable, and no matter how much they tried to wield proximity as a weapon, they only ended up revealing their own emptiness. Number 11. Your soul was a mirror that refused to lie. Most people have mastered the art of reflection, but it's not a reflection of who they truly are. They've learned how to reflect back what others want to see, what will keep them safe, what will help them fit in, or what will earn them approval. They've become chameleons, adapting their image to suit the world around them, blending in with whatever persona is needed to survive. But not you. You stayed authentic, and that made you dangerous in ways they couldn't comprehend. You weren't interested in playing the game of pretend. You didn't mirror the expectations, the social norms, or the flattering versions of what people thought they should be. No, your soul was a mirror that refused to lie. It didn't distort the truth. It didn't soften the edges. It didn't flatter people's egos or give them the comfort of believing in their own illusions. When people looked into your eyes, they were forced to see themselves for who they truly were. The good, the bad, the ugly. No more excuses, no more half-truths, just raw, unforgiving clarity. That's what made you dangerous to them. They weren't ready for that level of honesty, especially when they'd spent years hiding behind facades and carefully constructed versions of themselves. You didn't allow them to hide. Your presence exposed the things they refused to face, their insecurities, their dishonesty, their failures, and it made them uncomfortable. You didn't shame them, you didn't criticize them, but by simply existing in your truth, you reflected everything they'd been running from. The discomfort they felt around you wasn't because of you. It was because of the mirror you held up to their lives. They hated what they saw because it made them confront the parts of themselves they had long ago buried. And that truth, that was the real danger. Number 12. They misinterpreted your kindness as compliance. They misread every gesture of kindness as a sign of weakness. They assumed that because you showed compassion, you were somehow compliant, that your empathy was a door open for manipulation, and that your silence meant agreement. They thought that if they pushed hard enough, you would eventually bend to their will, that your soft-heartedness would make you an easy target for their schemes. They mistook your gentleness for ignorance and your patience for passivity. But by the time they realized they had misjudged you, it was already too late. You weren't naive, you were strategic. Every kind word, every moment of quiet observation, every pause before speaking was a deliberate choice. You didn't act impulsively. You understood people's motivations in ways they couldn't begin to comprehend. While they thought you were oblivious, you were quietly taking note of their behavior, calculating their moves, and reading between the lines of every interaction. You didn't need to react to everything. You knew the power of restraint. You understood that not every battle needed to be fought, especially when you had already mapped out their character in your mind. They were too busy underestimating you, thinking that your silence was surrender, your kindness was weakness, and your empathy was something they could take advantage of. They failed to recognize that your true strength lay in your ability to listen, observe, and assess without giving away your hand. They thought they had the upper hand, pushing you and testing your limits, but they didn't know that you were always 3 steps ahead. By the time they realized you weren't as naive as they thought, the game had already shifted and they were left with no way to catch up. You'd already seen through them. Number 13, your clean soul wasn't innocence. It was mastery. It wasn't that you had never encountered darkness. You had. You'd seen it firsthand, up close, in all its forms, the betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, the cruelty. You weren't naive and you weren't sheltered from the harsh realities of the world. You had been tested, pushed to your limits, and exposed to forces that could easily have hardened your heart or twisted your soul, but you didn't let it. You made a choice. A conscious, deliberate decision to remain unshaken, to refuse to let the darkness seep into you and change who you were. That's not innocence. Innocence suggests a lack of exposure, a purity that's unaware of the world's true nature. But what you had was something far more powerful: mastery. Mastery over your own soul. You saw the evil in the world, you felt the weight of it. But instead of letting it define you or drag you down, you chose to rise above it. You saw the ugliness others succumbed to, but you didn't let it soil your spirit. Where others were broken by their experiences, you emerged more resolute, more focused, and more in control of who you were becoming. Your ability to remain untouched, untethered to the negativity you witnessed, wasn't a sign of ignorance. It was a testament to your strength and discipline. You didn't let the world's darkness force you to become a part of it. Instead, you transcended it. You became a living example of how to navigate the worst of human nature without letting it alter your essence. You mastered the art of staying true to yourself, of keeping your heart and your soul intact, even when the world around you seemed determined to tear them apart. That's what made you so extraordinary. You chose light, not because you were innocent, but because you were powerful enough to wield it. Number 14. You lived under their microscope, but they forgot who created the lens. For 1,825 days they scrutinized you, magnifying every part of you under a microscope, convinced they would uncover imperfections, flaws, or weaknesses to use against you. They poked, prodded, and searched for any sign of corruption, any stain that would justify their assumptions or justify their need to tear you down. But in their obsession with dissecting you, they completely overlooked one key detail. They forgot who created the lens they were looking through. The architect of that lens wasn't them. It was Source itself. You see, the more they zoomed in, the more they examined you under their self-made microscope, the clearer your divinity became. With every flaw they thought they found, with every attempt to diminish your value, your true essence only shone brighter. What they didn't realize was that they weren't just looking at a human being. They were looking at a reflection of something greater, something divine. And the more they tried to tear you down, the more they exposed their own limited understanding of who and what you really were. They were so focused on finding dirt on you, they failed to notice the purity they were staring at. The more they magnified, the more they revealed their own ignorance and inability to see beyond their narrow perspective. They thought they could break you by pointing out your flaws, but all they did was reveal their own inability to grasp the truth of your existence. By the end of those 1,825 days, the only filth left was in their own reflection. They had spent all that time looking for dirt in you, and all they found was their own inability to see the divinity they were so desperately trying to destroy. In the end, you weren't just surviving their scrutiny, you were evolving beyond it. Every attempt to diminish you, to break you, to change you only served to reveal the power and grace you held within. While they tried to manipulate, distort, and break you down, you only grew stronger, more defined, and more rooted in your purpose. What they failed to realize is that their attempts to pull you into their darkness only made your light shine brighter. You were never meant to fit into their narrow views or their broken systems. You were meant to stand as a testament to something greater, something purer. You weren't the one on trial, they were. And as they tried to examine you under a microscope, they missed the fact that the only thing they were truly exposing was their own inability to comprehend the depth of your soul. So let them look back at the chapters of their lives. Let them reflect on the years they spent underestimating you. When they try to rewrite the story, your name will be the one they'll skip over, not because you were insignificant, but because your presence shone too brightly for them to face. You didn't bend to the world's expectations, and that was your strength. You chose to stay true to yourself, to your divine essence, no matter how much they tried to drag you into their chaos. In the end, it's not their judgment that defines you, but your own unwavering commitment to live authentically, to remain unshaken by the world around you. The universe sees what they couldn't. It recognizes the divine within you. And that, my friend, is what truly matters. You are not here to fit into anyone's mold, to live under anyone's microscope. You are here to rise above it all, to shine as an example of resilience, integrity, and the purest form of strength. And nothing, no amount of scrutiny or projection will ever change that. If this message resonated with you, if you felt that spark of recognition deep within, then don't miss out on the wisdom we share here. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment of powerful insights that help you grow, evolve, and stand firm in your truth. If you found this video impactful, give it a thumbs up, because your support matters. And don't just keep this wisdom to yourself. Share it with others who need to hear it. Let them know that they too are more powerful than they realize. And if you have thoughts, reflections, or questions, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. We're building a community of like-minded souls who understand that we're here for something bigger, something greater. Together we'll continue to rise. So go ahead, subscribe, like, share, and comment. Let's spread this energy and raise the collective vibration, because your voice matters and this journey is just beginning. Keep shining.